Last week, when the Israelis raided the Jenin camp, right outside the camp, there's a Hamdan family in a small apartment. They always take their apartment to be a sniping post and so on. They ruined their apartment and so on. They destroyed everything, but they also stole Ashraf Hamdan, who's 13 years old. They stole his PlayStation. You believe that the Israeli army should either give him back his PlayStation or compensate him for that? The last I looked, it was like $207.
So I'm unfamiliar with the facts of this case. So I don't want to speak to a specific incident in which I'm unfamiliar.
Okay, one final thing. When you say you guys want this criminal investigation to be conducted promptly, this is the case of a U.S. citizen for sure, but we have had similar back and forth about a number of other incidents where there was civilian harm, and then they disappear from the headlines. And we don't know what kind of action, if any, or accountability measures have been taken. So I'm wondering, has the United States set a timetable for when it expects Israel to conclude that? Like, what do you mean by prompt? Do you need an answer from them in a couple of weeks, or is it going to be 2 months?
We mean as soon as possible.
You said you expect Israel to make changes in their rules of engagement, but actually I remember there was an interview with Rachel Corrie's family last week, and they said this has been said by Secretary Blinken to Rachel Corrie's family before that. Israel already promised to make changes to their rules of engagement, and they cited a meeting with Secretary Blinken in 2011. So considering that
2011. 21 maybe.
Excuse me.
Yeah, no, just
2011. So considering that there haven't been any change in their rules of engagement, because another UN worker was also killed by an Israeli sniper after the killing of Aysenur. So it seems that there's no change in Israel's rules of engagement. Like what further steps?
So you guys work it out amongst yourselves, yeah.
Already done. Matt, can you give us a sense of where we are on the ceasefire talks? You guys had said about maybe a week or 10 days ago that you were a few days away from presenting a revised final, whatever, proposal, which hasn't come through. What's holding it up?
We continue to engage with our partners in the region, most specifically with Egypt and Qatar, about what that proposal will contain, and making sure, or trying to see that it's a proposal that can get the parties to an ultimate agreement. Don't have a timetable for you other than to say that we are working expeditiously to try to develop that proposal, try to find something that would bring both the parties to say yes and to formally submit it, but like I said, I don't have any updates on timing.
It's been out there that the main sticking points are Philadelphia corridor and hostages, prisoners. Would you say those are still the main sticking points that's holding it up?
Correct. Okay. I promise you. Camilla will go next.
Thank you. So opposition leader Yair Lapid was just here meeting with the secretary. Do you have any readout from that meeting?
I don't. I haven't spoken to the secretary since the meeting. I'll be happy to cover it in the briefing tomorrow.
Okay. And also Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant reportedly during his meeting with Amos Hochstein, he said the only way left to return the Israeli residents to the north to their homes is via military action. Do you have any comment on that? That sounds like things are not going well with diplomacy.
So I'm not going to comment about what took place in a private meeting, certainly one that took place between a White House official, not a State Department official, and a member of the Israeli government. But we have long made clear that we believe a diplomatic solution is the correct way, the only way to bring calm to the north of Israel and allow Israeli citizens to return to their homes. There are tens of thousands of Israelis who have been away from their homes for almost a year now, and certainly an expansion of the current conflict in the north is not something that would get them back to their homes in the near future at all. So we'll continue to push for a diplomatic resolution, and in our conversations with Israeli officials, they have always made clear, I think you've heard them say publicly on a number of occasions, that they would ultimately prefer a diplomatic resolution.
Can I follow up on that?
Yeah.
What's the current situation now on the northern? Is it
risk is higher
What's your assessment, the U.S. assessment to that?
So we continue to see strikes back and forth across the border, as you know, because you see them publicly. Both Israel targeting Hezbollah militants and Hezbollah facilities and Hezbollah infrastructure, as well as Hezbollah launching rockets and drones across the border. So that's something that has obviously was taking place before October 7th, but has really continued at an elevated pace since October 7th. And the point we have continued to make to Israel and other parties in the region is that ultimately this is something that needs to be resolved diplomatically. And I think the issues here are well known. It's very tough to achieve a diplomatic resolution to the conflict across the blue line as long as there is ongoing conflict in Gaza. And so that's not the chief reason, but one of the primary reasons why we continue to push to get a ceasefire in Gaza, because of the possibility we believe it would unlock for calm in the north.
Not only Gallant, also Netanyahu said that today he told the U.S. envoy that Israel will do what's necessary to ensure its security and safely return the northern residents to their homes. In case Israel decides to enter into war with Hezbollah, what would be your position?
So I'm not going to deal with hypotheticals, but certainly we believe that the best way to ensure that Israeli citizens can safely return to their homes in the north is a diplomatic resolution. In the same way we believe a diplomatic resolution is the best way to ensure that the tens of thousands of Lebanese who have been displaced from their homes in southern Lebanon can return home as well.
Are there red lines?
I'm just not going to. I'm not going to speculate at all about how this may unfold, other than to say we continue to push for a diplomatic resolution, and we do fundamentally believe it's in the interests of all the parties. Saeed.
Thank you, Matt. But to follow up on this question, basically Hezbollah said that the best way to have the people return is basically to achieve a ceasefire in Gaza. I think they stated that time and time again. So. I mean, that's a caveat there. So, going back to what you said to Humaira on the talks, where they are. Now, it is said that this week you're going to submit a new proposal. Can you update us on this thing?
I don't have any update from the answer I gave to Humaira 6 minutes ago, which is something that we are working on.
But we are looking at a new proposal sometime.
Yeah, we are working to submit a new proposal that we, along with Egypt and Qatar, that hopefully would get us to the finish line.
A couple more questions. Reports say that the medicines in Gaza are just totally empty. I mean, the stocks of medicines in Gaza are totally empty, and the situation is very dire. Can you update us on your effort, in terms of whether it's humanitarian aid or medicines and so on? I mean, especially since the dismantlement or the removal of the pier.
Yeah, we continue to work to get medical supplies into Gaza. We know there's a severe shortage of medical supplies there. It's something that our special envoy for humanitarian issues, Lise Grande, works on. And it's kind of, I'll say we work on that with our international partners, chiefly with humanitarian groups. And if you look at the success that we had in the last few weeks with unlocking a polio vaccination campaign that has now completed the first round of vaccinations for, I think, 90% of Gazan children, and is moving into the second phase of inoculations. That is the type of work that we're trying to do with all sorts of medical supplies to make sure that not just food and not just water, which is what people typically focus on. We talk about humanitarian assistance, but also medical supplies are making it into Gaza to get in the hands of doctors and other health care professionals who need to provide them to their patients.
And you think that Israel is doing all it can do to allow supplies in?
I think there are certainly a number of issues that we work through all the time, logistical issues, bureaucratic issues, and what we work on is trying to unlock those issues wherever they arise, whether they be with the government of Israel, whether they be with the various UN agencies that are operating inside Gaza, to try to make sure that medicine as well as food and water can get to where it actually needs to go.
Matt, I mean, in the last couple of days or 3 days, the Israelis killed 88 Palestinians in Gaza. I mean, it seems that they have exhausted all targets to achieve their goals. What are their goals at this stage? Is it just a killing enterprise, just keep going after the tents and killing people in tents and so on? And they always say there's a Hamas operative and so on. We never really know the fact. But is it worth it to keep killing these innocent people, to go after maybe one Hamas fighter?
Let me make clear what we want to see. We want to see a ceasefire. We want to see a ceasefire that brings an end to the suffering of the Palestinian people in Gaza. I will let the government of Israel speak to what their military goals are, but we have been quite clear that we think the path forward is to get a ceasefire that brings the hostages home, that stops the daily death and destruction in Gaza, that allows humanitarian assistance to move in a much improved manner, and that ultimately unlocks the possibility of lasting calm.
And a couple more on the settlements. Israel is building a settlement on a historic site as designated by UNESCO. Are you doing anything, to dissuade Israel from building on this very site?
So
in Batir, next to Beit Lahem?
Sorry. So as we've said before, settlements are inconsistent with international law. They run counter to efforts to achieve an enduring peace. Our understanding is that this particular settlement that you refer to south of Bethlehem is part of 5 new settlements that the Israeli cabinet approved in June. You heard us speak out against those settlements when they were approved, and we have spoken out against them since then, not just publicly, but also privately in conversations with the senior-most members of the Israeli government. Ultimately, we think that the settlement program doesn't just harm the Palestinian people, but it hurts Israel's peace. It hurts Israel's long-term security, and that's what we'll continue to impress upon the government of Israel.
And finally, last week when the Israelis raided the Jenin camp, right outside the camp, there's a Hamdan family in a small apartment. They always take their apartment to be a sniping post and so on. They ruined the apartment and so on. They destroyed everything, but they also stole Ashraf Hamdan, who was 13 years old. They stole his PlayStation. You believe that the Israeli army should either give him back his PlayStation or compensate him for that? The last I looked, it was like $207.
So I'm unfamiliar with the facts of this case. So I don't want to speak to a specific incident in which I'm unfamiliar. But no, obviously, a child's PlayStation in any event should not be taken away from them in the first place, and if so, should be returned.
So they should either give it back to him or compensate.
So I'm just telling you, I can't speak to the facts of this case. I've only heard what you've presented to me. But just as a general rule, of course, children's toys should not be taken from them, and if they are taken, they should be returned. I think that's a pretty safe principle. Yeah.
Can I just ask about the West Bank? Just go back to the killing of American-Turkish citizen Aysenur Eygi from last week, because the secretary commented on it while he was traveling. I just want to clarify a couple of things. So the IDF said effectively that it was an accident, but then we had reporting, namely Washington Post, saying the shots were taken after the peak of the protest. So there are discrepancies suggesting that perhaps it may not be an accident. What is the U.S. assessment on how she was killed?
So we are going to await the full criminal investigation that the government of Israel has launched before we make any determinations. Obviously, we are reading very closely the eyewitness accounts, and there have been numerous eyewitness accounts of what happened. You heard the secretary speak to those eyewitness accounts when he made his comments in London last week. Whether the eyewitness accounts are true, whether the accounts that the Israeli government made public are true, ultimately, this is a death that never should have happened. It's a killing that never should have happened. And it's why the secretary made clear that the Israeli security forces' rules of engagement need to be changed. So you don't continue to see the killing of unarmed civilians who are doing nothing more than showing up at a peaceful protest.
Right. A couple of things there. When do you anticipate this criminal investigation to conclude?
I don't have a timetable. I would refer to the government of Israel to speak to. It's ultimately their investigation.
Right.
But what we have said to them is that we want the investigation to be prompt, we want it to be thorough, and we want it to be transparent.
And is U.S. considering to launch its own investigation, given she's a U.S. citizen?
We're going to await the outcome of this investigation before we make any further determinations.
Okay. And has there been any communication with your Israeli counterparts or IDF since Secretary called for a change in their rules of engagement? Have they assured you that they will take it seriously and they will make changes?
There have been ongoing communications about this. The same concerns that the Secretary raised publicly, we have raised privately to them. Those conversations are ongoing, and I don't want to speak to them in any detail at this point.
And just why isn't the U.S. committing to an independent investigation, given that she was a U.S. citizen?
We want to see a transparent investigation, and if accountability is appropriate, we want to see accountability. I think before calling on any further steps, it's appropriate to let the first investigation play out. Now, if the first investigation plays out and we are briefed on the results and we are briefed on the process and we are briefed on the underlying facts and we're not satisfied, we will of course look at whether any other measures are appropriate, but we think it's appropriate in this instance to wait to let that first investigation play out before we go to any other steps.
Okay, one final thing. When you
I'll come to you
say
next.
you guys want this criminal investigation to be conducted promptly, this is the case of a U.S. citizen for sure, but we have had similar back and forth about a number of other incidents where there was civilian harm, and then they disappear from the headlines. And we don't know what kind of action, if any, or accountability measures have been taken. So I'm wondering, has the United States set a timetable for when it expects Israel to conclude that? Like, what do you mean by prompt? Do you need an answer from them in a couple of weeks, or is it going to be 2 months?
We mean as soon as possible. I cannot give you a timetable, and I think you'll know from covering investigative agencies. Investigative agencies always, and I used to work at one and be the spokesperson for one, always have a hard time giving you a timetable for an investigation because you don't know what you're going to find when you start investigating things and how long it's going to take. But we want it to happen as soon as possible, and we want it to be thorough, and we want the results to be transparent.
Okay, final thing. Can the U.S. commit to seeking accountability for its own citizen on this case?
So it depends what you mean by accountability, right? If there is, if the investigation shows that someone acted inappropriately, in violation of the law, in violation of the rules of engagement, in violation of IDF code of conduct, yes, of course we want accountability. But we also want a change that will prevent this kind of thing happening again. So you have long-term accountability to ensure that American citizens and others, Palestinians, citizens of other countries, aren't killed just for showing up at a peaceful protest. All right, go ahead.
You said you expect Israel to make changes in their rules of engagement. But actually, I remember, there was an interview with Rachel Corrie's family last week, and they said this has been said by Secretary Blinken to Rachel Corrie's family before that, Israel already promised to make changes to their rules of engagement. And they cited a meeting with Secretary Blinken in 2011. So considering that,
2011, 21 maybe.
Excuse me.
Yeah, no, just
2011. So considering that, there haven't been any change in their rules of engagement. Because, another UN worker was also killed by an Israeli sniper after the killing of Aysenur. So it seems that there's no change in Israel's rules of engagement. Like, what further steps?
So I cannot speak to.
Sorry.
I cannot speak to what changes they may or may not have made over the past few years, but any changes that they have made ultimately haven't been sufficient in preventing these kind of incidents from occurring, which is why the Secretary said last week that we want to see updates to their rules of engagement. That's what we're going to continue to engage with them. Ultimately, it is the results that matter here, and when you see American citizens and others showing up at peaceful protests and being killed, it is a problem that we want to see addressed.
Is that it? It's just, rule change in their rules of engagement. Is that it all the U.S. expects from Israel regarding the killing of their citizens?
So that is so. If there are, as I said in response to Humaira's question, ultimately, if anyone is found to behaved in violation of the law, in violation of code of conduct, we want to see accountability as well. But and when it comes to changes for rules of engagement, what we mean is not just accountability for this killing, but steps to prevent similar killings from happening in the future.
Also, there have been, criticisms from a lot of people, including Aysenur's family, that the U.S.'s response to Aysenur's killing has been very slow and insufficient. And there were reports over the weekend that no U.S. officials have attended her family. Can you confirm these reports? And if this is accurate, can you explain why?
So first of all, I will say that cannot understand the pain that her family is going through right now and how horrific it must be to lose a loved one in these circumstances, and our hearts truly do go out to them. I want to be respectful of their privacy in this situation. We have been in communication with her family on a number of occasions over the past week or so, and I think it's appropriate for us to keep those communications private.
So you can't tell us whether or not any U.S. officials have attended?
We have been in communication with her family, and as I said, I think I'll keep those communications private. Yeah.
On this, when Rachel Corrie was killed, in March 2003, the Israelis came back in 2012. Then, when Shiina Bakr was killed, in May, and then they came back on July 4th, and they said it was unintentional. And this time around, the Israelis are saying that, it was a bullet that ricocheted and so on, which seems to, be accepted in fact, the president. Right? So, is the case closed as far as the U.S. government is concerned?
It is very much not closed, and I think if you listen to the comments from the Secretary and other U.S. government officials last week, what we said is, even accepting the announced results of the preliminary investigation, even if you accept that as fact for what happened, it still shows that this is a killing that never should have happened. And that's why we want to see changes in Israel's rules of engagement to prevent such killings from happening again in the future.
Thank you, Matt. The White House has not contacted Aysenur Eygi's family 10 days out from her killing. Eyewitnesses themselves tell us that they actually haven't been reached out to for any Israeli-led investigation. Our colleagues at the Washington Post, of course, as you might have seen, reported footage and testimony that seemed to reveal that the Israeli military misled the U.S. and the world in its initial findings of how and when Aysenur was shot. When is the president and vice president going to reach out to Aysenur's family, and how can the U.S. continue deferring to Israel to investigate itself for killing an American if it has already at best misled and at worst lied in its preliminary findings, and how also given it hasn't reached out to eyewitnesses?
So, as I said, first of all, with respect to her family, which we know are experiencing this horrific tragedy, the U.S. government has had a number of conversations with the family. Hold on, let me just finish. It is not appropriate for me to get into those publicly. I never would in a situation like this, and I'm not going to here. But we have reached out to express our deepest condolences. I will say, when it comes to the investigation, I cannot speak for the investigation that's occurring now, other than to say we're going to expect it to be prompt, thorough, and transparent. And if it's not, and I don't think anyone should draw conclusions about an investigation while it's ongoing, but at the end of it, we will certainly be happy to look at how the investigation was conducted, what it produced, if there are any deficiencies, and if we don't find that it meets our standards, we'll have more to say at the time.
But is it not a red flag that the initial findings are already being discredited by testimony and footage?
So I think I already said, you heard me say earlier, even if you accept the initial findings, they don't present an acceptable outcome, right? You look at the initial findings, and they already tell you that something went tragically wrong, and you had the killing of an American citizen that never should have occurred. So when I hear people say sort of hold the initial findings up as if they somehow exonerated Israeli security forces, they very much do not. At least in our point of view, they very much do not exonerate them. They reveal the need for a number of changes, and we've made clear that's what needs to happen. But then when it comes to what ultimately happened and getting to the bottom of what ultimately happened, let's see how the investigation plays out. I do think we shouldn't draw any conclusions before it's final. And when we see the ultimate investigation, we'll have more to say based on our assessment of it.
And then finally, just on what you've said, that the U.S. is urging the Israeli forces to change its rules of engagement after Aysenur's killing. Of course, there's also World Central Kitchen worker Jacob Flickinger, the teenagers Mohammed Kadur, Tawfiq Abdul-Jabbar, our journalist colleague Shirin Abu Akleh, peace activist Rachel Corrie, 40,000 Palestinians, which of course you've condemned as well, the killing of them. The logic would follow that the U.S. has unconditionally funded a military with evidently insufficient rules of engagement up to this point. So is there any U.S. reflection on that idea?
The U.S. reflection on it is that Israel needs to change its policies, and we have made that quite clear. When it comes to the World Central Kitchen strike, we made clear that they need to change their deconfliction measures and worked with the UN to get new deconfliction measures in place. Now, those aren't perfect. We continue to see strikes that result in the death of humanitarian workers. We continue to see strikes in Gaza that lead to the tragic deaths of civilians. As you know, it is a very difficult place in which to conduct a military campaign because you have a terrorist organization that embeds itself and hides itself behind civilians, which is why It's the United States that is at the forefront of pushing for a ceasefire. And when it comes to actions in the West Bank, it's why it's the United States that's pushing for changes to the Israeli rules of engagement.
As you point out, those attacks have still continued. So if these urgings don't continue, will there not be a consideration to condition weapons?
We continue to work to get the best outcome possible, and we believe the best outcome possible when you look in Gaza is a ceasefire.
So
and that's why, hold on,
conditioning
let me
is not
just answer the question. And it's why we continue to work with Egypt and with Qatar to get a ceasefire over the line. Ultimately, we think that is the thing that would bring an alleviation to the suffering of the Palestinian people. Not any of the other steps we hear bandied about from time to time, but a ceasefire that brings a lasting end to the war. And when it comes to changes in the West Bank, it's the changes that we've proposed with others. Kylie, go ahead.
Just to follow up quickly on that,
Yeah.
you said that deconfliction is
Perfect. Is it the U.S. assessment at this point that the Israelis are doing the best that they can, and they've implemented some changes when it comes to deconfliction with NGOs?
I'm sure that there are always changes that further refinements that can be made. I mean, the problem that you have, and we've seen this over and over when it comes to incidents with humanitarian workers, is the government of Israel puts in place with the humanitarian aid groups a new set of deconfliction measures, and then you have an incident that exposes a flaw in one of them. You saw this recently with the strike against a convoy where the lead vehicle, I think I'll get the details wrong, but left the convoy, turned around, and was ultimately fired upon by Israel security forces. You get different things, you get different incidents that expose new problems that need to be solved. Ultimately, this isn't unique to this particular deconfliction problem is not unique to Gaza. It's something that tends to be the case in ongoing war zones where you have the difficulty of delivering humanitarian assistance while there is ongoing fighting. Now, of course, it is made even more acute because of the unique problem in Gaza of Hamas hiding itself behind human shields. But that's why we continue to work. It is really through an ongoing process with the humanitarian groups, with the UN, and with Israel to try to get the best possible deconfliction measures in place.
And it remains the U.S. assessment at this time that Israel is genuinely working to perfect those deconfliction channels.
There is always more that they can do, and we continue to engage with them about improvements that they can make on an ongoing basis.
Okay, and then just if we can pivot to Ukraine for a minute with the Secretary's visit. Last week, he came out of that visit saying that he and his UK counterpart would be presenting their findings with regard to the Ukrainians asked to strike deeper into Russia, and whether or not there would be a policy decision on that would hinge on President Biden's meeting with Prime Minister Starmer on Friday. That meeting is concluded. We haven't heard anything from you guys. So where does that conversation stand? Has there been a policy decision on that ask from the Ukrainians yet?
So first of all, you're right. The Secretary did say he would discuss his conversations with President Zelensky and other Ukrainian leaders, but he said he discussed them with the President, not with all of you. And he did do that on Friday, and of course we know that the Prime Minister was here to discuss their policy as well with the President. I don't have any announcements to make about changes in our policy today. We can continue to engage with our Ukrainian partners about the best way that they can support them to ensure that they win this war, the best way we can provide them with capabilities and intelligence support and other support, and that will continue to be our commitment, but I don't have any announcements to make on policy.
But it's still possible that the policy could change, or you guys have decided to keep it intact the way it is?
I don't have any announcements to make today. We always, and this is just a general statement that covers our policy when it comes to Ukraine, engage with the Ukrainians about what they need and how best we can support them. And as I know you've all heard the Secretary say many times, adapt and adjust those policies as necessary to best support them in a way that makes strategic sense and provides them capabilities that they can actually use and that they can support and that they're trained on. And that will continue to be our policy going forward.
So you don't think they need to strike deeper inside Russia right now?
I said I don't have any announcements to make about changes today. Yeah, Eva, go ahead.
Follow up on that question about the investigation. Does
Yeah.
this apply to all your allies? When a U.S. citizen is killed, you don't interfere, you wait until the investigation is the outcome of the investigation,
I'm
and
sorry.
whether it is repeated, and if the incident was repeated many times.
So I'm not going to deal with a hypothetical about going forward, but it would always depend on the circumstance. If we saw an ally that was conducting an investigation, or in this case, bless you, conducted an initial investigation, briefed us on the results, and said they were conducting a full investigation, we would certainly take that into consideration in what steps we might take. But that's not to foreclose any further steps on our end if we think it's appropriate and necessary at a later time.